0.3 percentage point of China's GDP growth. But that's just the first round. The more important.
大家好啊，今天是2025年的2月6号。之前给大家分享的这个大摩的这个闭门会议都是中文版的，今天给大家分享英文版的大摩会议，它是主要是大摩的首席邢自强他的一个英文版的分享。在英文版这个分享里面，他可能更敢说一些啊。我们先一起来看一下，然后我再针对分享内容，最后给大家做一下总结。
So as the U.S. increased the tariff on China, I will focus on three things. One is we think this is the start of escalation. So why the risk of further escalation is very high for the U.S.-China trade tensions. Second, the implications to the Chinese economy, particularly what does this mean for China's domestic stimulus and also retaliation measures. Finally, what about our forecast numbers, the GDP and the deflation problem in China? So let me start with the impact of the current tariff on China. So we think it's going to knock off 0.3 percentage point of China's GDP growth in 2025 if what has been announced by the White House will be fully implemented, which means basically with no exemption, 10% additional tariff on everything from China. That could knock 0.3 percentage point of China's GDP growth. But that's just the first round. The more important thing here is the risk of further escalation could be very high because apparently, as Chetan also mentioned, the U.S. administration is focusing not just on controlling drug flows, but also on reducing the trade deficit. And the U.S.-China trade deficit close to 400 billion is huge. And as of now, there is no signal that the U.S. is just using this as negotiating concessions. It actually signaled a very tough stance, try to bring trade imbalance back to balance. So that's going to make this tariff with China very sticky. And more importantly, there are a couple of ongoing investigations on U.S.-China trade, including the $800 small article export exemption, including the phase 1 deal. They are reviewing what happened to that and the 301 investigation related to the phase 1. All of these will probably be done by early April. And that gave the U.S. administration more reasons to increase tariff on China. Now, a lot of investors asked us, maybe there's a opportunity for reaching a deal. I mean, the U.S.-China tensions, as we mentioned, is much, much more complicated than U.S. versus other countries. But let's see, can U.S. and China sit down and strike a new trade deal? For example, let's review what happened to phase 1 deal. Can they go back to re-sign a phase 1 deal, re-deliver that? The short answer is it is very difficult. China agreed to purchase 200 billion extra imports from the US in phase 1 deal. And 2 years after that, they completed roughly 60%. So definitely it's undershooting. And if you look at the category of goods, they reached slightly higher on agricultural goods, but anything else, oil and gas, manufacturing goods, tech, they are far lagging behind. And today, 6 years after phase 1, a lot of things changed. For example, Chinese supply chain become even more dominant and competitive. As Chetan mentioned, the market share of Chinese goods in global market is just higher than 6 years ago. Out of 96 categories of goods, China today have more trade surplus, more competitiveness in 57 out of these 96 versus 6 years ago. So both US and China, if you look at their supply, their capacity, they're probably more entrenched than 6 years ago on reaching a deal because there's not many things China can buy from the US, maybe except LNG. But we calculated the delta from purchasing LNG from the US is only $10 billion, $15 billion, comparing to that $400 billion trade surplus between US and China. That's like a drop in the ocean. It's simply not enough to move the needle. So looking back, the phase one deal was ambitious, and today re-signing that phase one deal is much, much harder than 6 years ago. That's why I think the risk of further escalation between US and China tariff will be very high. Usually China will retaliate the same way, basically same magnitude, matching the US tariff with 10% on the US goods to China. But because the Chinese imports from the US is much smaller, it's probably going to less impactful for Chinese economy or inflation. But I think the more important question, as Chetan put out, is if there is a broader, faster implementation of these tariffs and it's becoming stickier, then it's affecting global corporate confidence, then it could be potentially worse than 2018 to 2019. So what about our numbers for China? We are way below market consensus on China growth for this year, both nominal and real. We have a real GDP growth forecast of 4%, and our nominal GDP is below 4%, with the deflation being more persistent. Now, with the tariff, which we have built in some of the tariff in our model, for example, we have a 15% gradual increase for this year, followed by another 10% increase in tariff next year. So far, this 10% is roughly 2/3 of our impact on Chinese growth modeled in our year-end outlook. However, if the US impose more and more tariffs on top of this 10%, for example, after wrapped up the ongoing investigations, there is definitely a worse scenario of tariff beyond what's already in our base case. At this moment, with this 10%, we feel quite comfortable with our 4% below consensus GDP forecast and the below 4% nominal GDP forecast. Both are much weaker than market consensus. We'd like to stick with these numbers. And this also implied devaluation pressure for the RMB. We have a 7.6 USD CNY level target for year end. And I think once the tariff is here, PBOC may gradually allow the currency to be more flexible. But given China's weak starting point, they are also working a very fine line, try to be opting on currency stability, capital flows, as well as monetary easing. So this is so-called impossible trinity. And in the end, we think devaluation, but much milder than what happened in 2018 to 19. That's why we are targeting 7.6 for the USD CNY. Last but not least, stimulus. As you can see from this chart, we think China's stimulus will be reactive. They planned in the Central Economic Work Conference something close to RMB 2 trillion yuan expansion in their augmented fiscal deficit. That's roughly 1.4% of GDP. That's a very small, very modest package, and it's still largely supply-centric. We think they will stick with that plan because the 10% tariff, they are still monitoring how it could affect the economy, the job market. They won't be doing anything beyond what had been planned in the Central Economic Work Conference. But what could trigger change is always the social dynamics, the feedback from the indicator we built, unemployment, consumer confidence, frequency of labor incidents. Right now, it shows some temporary stabilization because fourth quarter data stabilized a little bit given the September pivot. And the first quarter is usually fine, particularly given more front-loaded exports ahead of tariff risks. So it may take longer, maybe a couple of quarters or even longer by second half or later this year that we see the feedback to social dynamics, some double dip in social stability perception. That could trigger a deeper understanding of the deflation problem and a more decisive change of policy. But before that, they will just stick to that modest package. So undershooting domestic stimulus, some retaliation of tariff rates, but overall, this will make China's deflation more persistent, and we stick to our below consensus, both real GDP and the nominal GDP forecast for this year. With that, I will stop here and hand over to Daniel. Yes, I mean, over the last 3 to 4 weeks before the tariff announcement, PBOC has been opting for the currency stability at the cost of monetary easing. They didn't deliver any rate or triple cuts, despite they used the monetary loosening stance in their CWC document. And right now, I do think with this tariff announcement, they will probably allow a bit more devaluation to absorb some of this tariff impact. But we are talking about a single-digit devaluation. If this year, eventually the cumulative tariff increase on China could be 15% as our model priced in, we are expecting USD CNY to reach 7.6 by year end. That affecting roughly 4% devaluation against the dollar. Unlike back in 2018 to 19, the devaluation of renminbi versus the increase in tariff, it was a 1-to-1 ratio. The tariff increased by 12% and the Chinese yuan depreciated by 11.5%. This time, we think the devaluation will be much, much milder, simply because given the weak starting point of China's domestic challenges, the PBOC is more concerned about any meaningful devaluation could trigger self-fulfilling capital outflow. It's being seen as a weaker statement for the economy. It's going to have more confidence impact. So that's why we are looking for modest devaluation, 7.6 by year end. But of course, in a worse scenario, if the US is imposing tariff beyond what we talked about, 15% for this year, say they have 25% for this year, then we have to bring forward some of next year's devaluation to this year. Right now, we have a 7.75. That's our 2026 year-end price target for USD CNY, based on there will be another 10% increase in tariff on China next year. But if the increase in tariff this year is beyond our expectation in that worst scenario, then we may need to bring forward that devaluation to this year. That's it.
那接下来我把大摩这个英文版分享内容做个总结啊。第一个呢，就是10%可能只是个起步，刚开始啊。今年大摩预测美国对中国的关税是15%。第一阶段的协议执行的并不好啊，只完成了60%啊，所以达成新版贸易协议的可能性呢比较低。第三个呢，受到关税的影响，中国的 GDP 增长呢可能会降低0.3个百分点啊。视频里说3个百分点，其实就是降低0.3。比方说今年的 GDP 增长是4%，那降低0.3个百分点，那就是3.7%这个样子。那还有呢，就是中国目前不会出台更大力度的刺激政策，因为去年第4季度的 GDP 增长数据还可以，以及第一季度抢出口的这个长尾的效应还会存在，应该也 GDP 数据也不会看起来太差，所以高层呢不会推出更大力度的刺激政策啊。只有当民生反馈指数变得更差的时候，高层才有可能推出更大力度的刺激政策。关于人民币汇率这一块，他觉得人民币可能会贬值到 7.6 吧，温和的贬值，从而对冲关税带来的影响。如果说贬值太多，会引发资本外流，减弱民众呢对国内经济的这样的一个信心。这个就是大摩邢自强想表达的这个意思吧。好，这次的分享呢就到这里，谢谢大家。